For the quietly tired hearts who've carried so much for so long, this is for you. Have you ever done everything right and still watched life unravel? You played by the rules. You worked hard. You showed up. You gave your best to your family, your career, your dreams, believing that if you just held things together long enough, eventually peace would come. But somewhere along the way, something broke. The plan changed. The job disappeared. The relationship shifted. The body you once trusted now whispers its limits. And in the stillness of a quiet evening, when the noise fades and the masks come off, a single aching question lingers. Why can't I control this? You're not alone. We live in a culture that worships control, where success is measured by how well we manage, optimize, predict. But Buddhist wisdom gently invites us to consider another possibility. What if control was never the goal? What if control was the illusion? At the heart of many spiritual traditions, especially Buddhism, is this quiet, liberating truth. Peace doesn't come from holding on. It comes from learning to let go. Let go of the fantasy that we can fix everything. Let go of the pressure to have it all figured out. Let go of the fear that if we stop clenching, everything will fall apart. Because sometimes it's only when we loosen our grip that we finally feel held. In this episode of Mindful Healing, we're not offering quick answers. We're not promising a 5-step formula for happiness. Instead, we'll walk side by side through stories, teachings, and simple practices that invite you to exhale, to pause, to consider that maybe the thing you've been searching for has been quietly waiting beneath all the striving. This is not about giving up. It's about coming home to a way of living that is rooted not in fear, but in trust. Not in control, but in presence. So if you're tired of the chase, if you're ready to explore what real peace might feel like, you're in the right place. Take a deep breath. This journey begins not with doing more, but with letting go. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Control in the Search for Peace. Control, for many of us, is the invisible axis upon which we spin our lives. We build routines, set expectations, and cling to certainty as if peace were hidden in our ability to predict the future. But Buddhist wisdom invites us to ask a deeper question. Is control real, or is it just another layer of delusion? The Buddha taught that suffering arises not from what happens to us, but from our resistance to what happens. When we demand permanence from a world built on impermanence, we invite disappointment into every corner of our lives. One of the foundational teachings of Buddhism is anicca, or impermanence. Everything is in motion. The body ages, emotions rise and fade, relationships shift. Even our sense of self transforms over time. Yet we try to freeze-frame moments we love and fast-forward through moments we hate. This is the illusion of control at play. In my own life, I've seen how this craving for control becomes a quiet form of suffering. I once spent years working toward a career milestone, a specific title, a specific income bracket. I told myself that once I reached it, I would finally feel calm. But the moment I arrived, that peace was nowhere to be found. Instead, a new anxiety took its place. Now that I've got it, how do I keep it? What I learned was this. Peace doesn't come from achieving certainty. It comes from embracing uncertainty. To truly understand the illusion of control, we must observe how often we grip tightly to things, routines, outcomes, even identities. For instance, think of the way many people plan for their future happiness by earning more money, finding the right partner, or shaping the perfect life. But these efforts are often driven not by joy, but by fear. Fear of what might happen if we don't hold the reins. Fear that we are not enough unless life is under our command. But what if peace isn't found in mastering life, but in meeting life? A monk once told me, to hold tightly is to fear life. To open your palm is to trust it. Letting go is not passive. It is the most courageous thing we can do. It means meeting every moment without clinging, without pushing it away. One of the most transformative practices I've experienced is learning to pause when my plans unravel. Rather than forcing a solution, I try to witness the discomfort. This doesn't mean giving up. It means opening to what the moment is trying to teach. There's a Zen story of a man who loses his horse, and everyone in the village tells him, "What bad luck?" He simply replies, "Maybe." The next day the horse returns, bringing with it a wild horse. "What good luck?" the villagers say. Again he says, "Maybe." Later his son breaks his leg while riding the wild horse. More cries of bad luck. The man only says, "Maybe." Soon after, the army comes to draft young men for war. His son is spared because of the injury. The morale? We never truly know what an event means when it happens. Trying to control the narrative only binds us in anxiety. Surrender in this context becomes a form of wisdom. The mind, when left unchecked, constantly strategizes, plans, replays, and predicts. We are taught to believe that if we just think hard enough, we can control everything. But Buddhist psychology offers a different view. Our need to control arises from aversion, pushing away what we dislike, and craving, clinging to what we like. These are two roots of suffering, tanha and dosa. By observing our urge to control, we begin to see its futility. Try this. The next time your day doesn't go as planned, pause. Notice the tension in your body. Notice the narrative your mind creates. Then ask, is this tension coming from the event or from my resistance to it? This practice reveals something powerful. The situation is often neutral. It is our grasping that creates the storm. Imagine your life as a river. You can try to dam the flow, redirect it, or fight the current, or you can learn to float. Floating doesn't mean giving up your agency. It means understanding where effort is needed and where surrender is wiser. This insight is echoed in the practice of mindful acceptance, a cornerstone of meditation. When you sit in stillness and observe your breath, your mind will wander. The point is not to control it, but to gently bring it back. In doing this again and again, we train ourselves to release the illusion that we must control everything. Letting go of control does not mean life becomes chaotic. On the contrary, it becomes clear. When we stop trying to micromanage the universe, we find the space to respond, not react. We find stillness in motion. We begin to trust that peace is not the reward of perfect circumstances. It is the result of inner alignment. In the end, the real question is not, how do I gain more control? But rather, how do I deepen my trust in life as it is? Chapter 2. The Alchemy of Anger and the Power of Non-Reaction. Anger is a natural emotion. It surges like a flame when we feel threatened, misunderstood, or hurt. In its most primal form, it's a defense mechanism, a response designed to protect. But in the teachings of Buddhism, we're invited to go deeper. We're asked not simply to manage anger, but to understand its roots and ultimately to transform it. The Buddha described anger as a poison of the mind, one of the three unwholesome roots alongside greed and delusion. But he also taught that anger is not the enemy. It is a messenger. The problem arises when we react to anger rather than observe it. I remember a moment years ago when someone I trusted deeply said something that cut through me like a blade. I felt an immediate rush of heat. My chest tightened, my jaw clenched. I wanted to respond, to retaliate, to make them feel what I felt. But instead, I did something that changed me. I walked away and sat in silence. In that quiet space, I realized something shocking. Not only was I angry at their words, but I was also angry that I had been vulnerable. That realization shifted everything. The anger wasn't just about the surface. It was pointing to a much older wound. This is the alchemy of anger. When held in mindful awareness, it reveals the parts of ourselves that are still waiting to be healed. Anger, when reacted to impulsively, is fire. It burns, it destroys, it spreads. But when held gently, mindfully, it becomes warmth. It becomes clarity. It becomes transformation. One of the most powerful Buddhist metaphors is this. Holding on to anger is like holding a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You're the one who gets burned. The modern mind often interprets this as a call for suppression, but that's a misunderstanding. The Buddha didn't ask us to suppress anger. He asked us to see it clearly, without clinging, without pushing it away. Non-reaction is not weakness. It is radical strength. We live in a world that often equates reaction with power. The louder voice wins. The quicker retort is praised. But this is surface-level strength. Beneath it often lies fear, insecurity, and pain. In contrast, Buddhism invites us into a space of inner spaciousness, where we respond from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff. A gust of anger approaches like a storm. You have two choices. You can leap into it, letting it carry you away, or you can stand firm, watching it pass. The practice of mindfulness gives us that footing. It gives us the pause between stimulus and response, the space where freedom lives. One of the most transformational practices I've adopted is what I call the sacred pause. When anger arises, I don't immediately speak or act. I acknowledge the fire, and then I breathe. I feel it in my body. I ask myself, what is this anger trying to protect? Sometimes the answer surprises me. It's not about the person who offended me. It's about an unhealed memory, a past betrayal, or a hidden fear of rejection. In those moments, I realize that anger is never just about the trigger. It's about the tenderness beneath it. And this is where compassion enters. When you can look at your own anger with softness, you begin to look at others with the same compassion. The person who yelled at you is probably fighting a battle you cannot see. The colleague who snapped at you may be drowning in fear or grief. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it helps us respond with wisdom rather than retaliation. In one retreat I attended, a monk told a story about a young boy who would always lash out in anger. His teacher gave him a hammer and a bag of nails and told him to hammer a nail into the fence every time he got angry. Over time, the boy grew tired and learned to pause. Eventually, he stopped hammering nails. The teacher then told him to remove one nail for every time he responded to anger with calm. The boy slowly pulled out each nail. When he was done, the teacher showed him the holes in the fence and said, "These are the scars left behind. You may be forgiven, but the impact remains. So choose your words wisely." That story stayed with me, because that's the truth of anger. Once released into the world through words or actions, its consequences ripple far beyond our intentions. But what if we learn to sit with it instead? One technique that has helped me and countless others is naming the emotion. When I feel anger rise, I silently say, "This is anger." That simple act shifts the relationship. I am no longer in the anger. I am the awareness of it. That distance creates power. Not power over others, but power over the conditioned mind. The Dalai Lama once said, "If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion." This includes compassion for yourself when you're angry. Too many people feel shame for their emotions, especially spiritual seekers. But Buddhism doesn't shame anger, it transforms it. There is also a powerful connection between anger and unmet needs. Often, we lash out when our need for safety, understanding, or respect isn't met. When we become aware of this, we stop demonizing the emotion and start listening to it. And in listening, we gain insight. Imagine if every time you felt angry, you asked, "What am I truly needing right now? What am I believing in this moment that might not be true? Can I meet this moment without abandoning myself or attacking another?" That is the path of the inner warrior, not one who fights, but one who sees. In the end, the goal is not to never feel anger again. That would be unrealistic and even unhealthy. The goal is to stop being possessed by it. When we stop feeding the fire of anger with reaction, it begins to cool. And what remains is not weakness, but clarity. boundaries become clearer, communication becomes wiser, relationships become deeper, and most importantly, we begin to reclaim our inner sanctuary, one breath, one pause, one mindful moment at a time. Chapter 3, Letting Go of Attachment, the Art of Sacred Release. In Buddhist philosophy, attachment, upadana, is not simply the act of loving or caring deeply. It is the clinging that binds us to suffering. Attachment is the invisible tether we tie between ourselves and impermanent things, convinced that our happiness depends on their permanence. But everything we grasp, people, status, ideas, even identities, is in constant flux. To cling is to struggle against reality. The Buddha taught that attachment is one of the primary causes of dukkha, the suffering that pervades existence. But this truth can be difficult to accept. We often confuse love with possession. We believe that to care means to hold on. But true love, in the Buddhist sense, is more like the sun, warm, life-giving, and non-grasping. It shines without trying to keep. There was a time in my life when I was deeply attached to a relationship. I had built dreams around it, wrapped my identity inside it. I feared losing it, not just because I loved the person, but because I didn't know who I would be without them. So I clung harder. I tried to control, to fix, to hold tighter. But in doing so, I began to suffocate both of us. The more I clung, the more the relationship withered. Eventually it ended, and in the aftermath, I felt as if I had lost everything. But over time, through quiet reflection and a deep dive into Buddhist practice, I began to see what had really been lost. Not the person, but the illusion. The illusion that my wholeness depended on another. That realization opened a new door. Freedom through non-attachment. Letting go is not about apathy or withdrawal. It is the practice of loving fully without the need to possess. It is embracing the beauty of an experience without demanding it last forever. It is the ability to say, I love this, and if it changes, I will still be okay. A beautiful metaphor from the Zen tradition compares life to a cherry blossom, stunning in its bloom, and yet so short-lived. Its beauty lies precisely in its impermanence. To love it is to bow to its fleeting nature, not to tape its petals in place. Non-attachment is an inner stance. It doesn't mean you don't feel or that you care less. It means you care with openness. When something ends, a job, a phase of life, a friendship, you do not collapse. You bow, you bless, and you release. In meditation, this practice shows up in the form of noticing without clinging. Thoughts arise, feelings swell, but instead of grasping, you observe. You don't chase the pleasant or flee from the unpleasant. You simply sit with it all, like watching clouds pass across a sky that doesn't try to hold them. In daily life, non-attachment invites us to examine how often we hold on, not just to people, but to expectations, roles, titles, and outcomes. Ask yourself, what am I afraid to lose? What would it mean about me if this changed? Am I holding on, or am I participating freely? Sometimes we even cling to pain. We replay wounds, wear them like badges. But to heal, we must eventually loosen our grip. As one teacher once told me, you don't have to keep telling the story of the storm to appreciate the peace that follows. Letting go also means loosening our grip on who we think we should be. We attach so tightly to identities, the successful one, the fixer, the strong one, that we lose contact with who we really are. But identity is as impermanent as any external thing. When we stop clutching, we begin to meet ourselves more honestly. One exercise I often use is this. Write down what you're most attached to right now. Then ask, what am I afraid will happen if I lose this? That fear is the root of the attachment. Meet it with compassion, not judgment. You don't have to let go instantly. You only need to loosen the grip, one breath at a time. The Buddha described this process like loosening a tight knot. patient, gentle, deliberate. He didn't teach detachment as cold rejection, but as clear seeing. The wisdom to recognize what cannot be held and the grace to let it go without losing love. Letting go becomes easier when we remember this simple truth. Everything we truly need cannot be taken from us. Peace, presence, clarity, and compassion. These arise from within. Everything else is passing scenery. Non-attachment brings us back to the present. It reminds us that clinging to the past or fearing the future robs us of the only place we can be alive. Here now. Imagine your life as a river. You're sitting in a boat watching leaves float past. Some are beautiful, some are painful, but all are moving. To reach out and grab them is to unbalance your boat. To watch them pass is to remain steady, centered, and free. Chapter 4. The Ego's Disguise, Humility as a Doorway to Wholeness. The ego is a master of disguise. It doesn't always appear as arrogance or vanity. Sometimes it shows up in subtler ways. Defensiveness, the need to be right, or the constant comparison to others. In Buddhist philosophy, the ego is not a solid self, but a construct, a story we tell ourselves about who we are. And like any story, it's filled with assumptions, edits, exaggerations, and omissions. What we call I is not fixed. It is made up of shifting thoughts, roles, emotions, memories, and identities. Yet we grasp at this I as if it were real and permanent. This clinging becomes a barrier. It separates us from others, creates suffering, and distorts reality. The Buddha didn't reject the self as evil. He revealed its emptiness, not in the sense of lacking, but in the sense that it is not independently existing. Everything we are arises in interdependence. The body, the mind, the personality. They are conditions, not constants. There was a time in my own spiritual journey when I mistook confidence for self-importance. I thought that being right, being the teacher, being respected meant I had value. But the deeper I went into meditation and mindfulness, the more I realized that true peace arises not when I'm admired, but when I disappear into presence. There's a powerful paradox here. The more we let go of the need to be someone, the more we become who we truly are. Humility is not self-erasure. It is the spaciousness that arises when we no longer need to perform. It is the quiet confidence that doesn't depend on comparison or recognition. It is the realization that we are part of something vast, interconnected, and alive. Ego thrives on separation. It feeds on the illusion that I am over here and you are over there. But this separation is a veil. The more we see through it, the more compassion naturally arises. Because when there is no rigid me, there is room for we. In Buddhist psychology, this insight is deeply connected to the concept of anatta, non-self. It doesn't mean we don't exist. It means that we are not the fixed, isolated self we often believe ourselves to be. We are a constellation of conditions. And when those conditions shift, so do we. Think about how different you were 10 years ago, not just in appearance, but in values, fears, dreams, even the way you speak. That version of you no longer exists, yet we cling to a false sense of continuity. The ego doesn't like this truth. It wants to be known, to be seen, to be admired. It wants control, status, and validation. But the more we feed it, the more restless we become. The ego is never satisfied because it is built on fear of being nothing. But in spiritual practice, to become nothing is not to lose. It is to awaken. In one silent retreat, I was meditating near a large open field. I remember looking up at the night sky, stars stretching endlessly above me. In that vastness, the me I had spent years constructing suddenly felt absurdly small. But instead of fear, I felt relief. I didn't need to be important. I didn't need to be special. I just needed to be. That was the doorway to humility, Not self-loathing, but self-liberation. Humility allows us to see others more clearly. When we drop the mask of self-importance, we listen more deeply. We no longer need to defend or dominate conversations. We no longer need to prove. Instead, we become curious, open, and present. One practice I've found incredibly helpful is simply noticing when the ego is speaking. It often begins with "I deserve," "I should," "How dare they," or "What will they think?" These are cues. In those moments, I pause. I don't try to silence the ego. I just don't follow its lead. I remind myself this isn't who I am. This is just a passing voice. In Buddhist monastic traditions, humility is not about lowering oneself. It is about recognizing the truth of interconnection. A teacher once told me, "The mountain doesn't boast of its height. It simply stands." That is true humility, strength without show, presence without pretense. This humility also gives birth to resilience, because when we no longer need to protect a fragile ego, we become free to learn, to fail, to be wrong, to grow. We don't crumble under criticism or inflate under praise. We stay grounded, like the Bodhi tree, rooted in reality, open to all seasons. In relationships, humility softens conflict. It allows us to say, "I may not know everything. I might have misunderstood. Let's find truth together." This simple shift dissolves walls and builds bridges. In practice, you can cultivate humility by engaging in silent service, doing something good without taking credit, or by letting someone else be right, even when you could prove them wrong. These small acts dismantle the ego's craving for superiority. Ultimately, ego is not something to destroy, but something to understand. The more we see its patterns, the less power it holds. And in the absence of ego, what emerges is something far more beautiful: authenticity, compassion, and connection. The path of humility is not glamorous, it's not loud, but it is powerful. It makes space for others. It makes room for truth. And it opens the heart to the deepest kind of joy, the joy of belonging to something greater than the self. Chapter 5. The Power of Speech, Cultivating Words that Heal. In the Buddhist path, right speech is not merely about being polite or avoiding conflict. It is a profound discipline, one that shapes not only our relationships with others, but also the quality of our inner world. Words are not neutral. They are carriers of energy, capable of both nourishing and wounding, of building or breaking, of healing or harming. The Buddha taught that before speaking, we should ask ourselves 3 questions. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? At first glance, these questions may seem simple, but try applying them in your daily life. You'll quickly see how often we speak not out of clarity, but out of impulse, pride, or habit. There was a time in my own life when I believed that honesty alone justified whatever I said. I would pride myself on being direct, mistaking bluntness for truth. But over time, I began to notice the subtle harm my words could cause, not only to others, but to myself. I realized that truth without compassion is just another form of aggression. Right speech isn't about suppressing your truth. It's about delivering it with wisdom. In Buddhist teachings, samavaka, or wise speech, includes 4 key elements: abstaining from false speech, abstaining from divisive speech, abstaining from harsh speech, abstaining from idle chatter. Each of these is a gateway to deeper presence. False speech damages trust, the invisible thread that connects us to others. Even small lies, repeated often, create an internal split. We begin to lose integrity, and with it, our inner peace. Divisive speech, gossip, slander, subtle criticism erodes community. It separates rather than unites. It may offer a temporary sense of superiority, but it leaves behind disconnection and mistrust. Harsh speech, even when justified, leaves wounds. We often say, "I was just being honest," without recognizing the violence carried in our tone. But the Buddha reminds us that how we say something is just as important as what we say. Idle chatter may seem harmless, but it distracts us from depth. It scatters our energy and keeps us at the surface of life. Mindful silence is not emptiness. It is a form of listening, a way of honoring the sacredness of presence. I remember attending a 10-day silent retreat where we were not allowed to speak at all, not even a word. At first, it was unbearable. I realized how addicted I was to filling space with noise. But gradually, something shifted. Without the shield of language, I began to notice subtle cues. The kindness in someone's eyes, the tension in their shoulders, the gentle rhythm of the wind in the trees. In that silence, I learned something profound. When words are used mindfully, they become sacred. From that point on, I began to speak less, but with more intention. I noticed how a kind word, offered at the right moment, could soothe a heavy heart. I saw how simply listening without interrupting could be more healing than any advice. I learned that sometimes the most powerful response is presence. One practice I've adopted is intentional speech fasting, a few hours each week where I refrain from all unnecessary speaking. During this time, I observe my mind. I watch the impulse to speak arise, and instead of following it, I sit with it. Often I discover that what I wanted to say wasn't truly important. Another practice is the cup test. Before speaking, I ask if my words can fill another person's cup, or if they're just a way to empty my own frustration. If they come from tension or ego, I hold them back. If they come from care or clarity, I speak them with softness. There's a Zen saying, "Speak only if it improves upon the silence." That silence is not cold or awkward. It is the still field in which wisdom grows. Mindful speech also includes the willingness to apologize, not from guilt, but from awareness. When we've said something that harmed, even unintentionally, we can own it. Not to shame ourselves, but to restore harmony. A sincere apology, spoken humbly, has the power to heal wounds that time alone cannot. On the other side, we also learn to receive words wisely. Not all criticism is an attack. Not all silence is rejection. As our awareness deepens, we become less reactive, more spacious. We listen to what is being said and also to why it's being said. We begin to realize that every word we speak builds something, a wall or a bridge, a burden or a blessing. This understanding transforms ordinary conversation into spiritual practice. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to cultivate compassion, patience, and presence. And let's not forget the way we speak to ourselves. The inner dialogue, the voice that narrates your life, can be your greatest ally or your most relentless critic. Many people live with an inner voice that constantly says, "I'm not enough. I failed again. I'll never change." These words shape our self-image more than any outer judgment. Mindful speech begins at home. It begins with learning to speak to ourselves with tenderness. Try this. The next time you make a mistake, instead of scolding yourself, say, "This is hard and I'm still learning." Watch what happens. That one sentence can shift your whole nervous system from shame to self-compassion. In the end, the path of wise speech is not about perfection, it's about alignment. Alignment between your heart and your voice, between truth and kindness, between awareness and expression. Let your words be like soft rain, gentle, nourishing, and life-giving. Chapter 6, The Great Illusion, Dissolving the Sense of Separateness. Of all the illusions the mind clings to, perhaps the most persistent and most damaging is the illusion of separateness. It is the belief that I am over here and you are over there, that my suffering is mine alone, and your joy has nothing to do with me. This illusion builds walls, breeds loneliness, and fuels the quiet ache of disconnection so many people carry in silence. Buddhist philosophy points directly to this root misunderstanding through the lens of interbeing, a term popularized by Thich Nhat Hanh, echoing the ancient truth of pratidya samutpada, or dependent origination. Nothing exists in isolation. Every phenomenon, every breath, every tree, every thought arises due to countless conditions. Strip away any one part of the web, and the whole is changed. But the ego doesn't like this truth. It thrives on separation, on my desires, my pain, my goals, my identity. It sees difference everywhere and builds a story around that difference. And while this story may feel empowering at times, it eventually becomes a cage. I remember one moment that shifted my understanding. I was sitting in a crowded train station, tired and mentally drained, when I noticed an elderly woman struggling to carry her bags. I watched people pass by her without a glance. Something in me hesitated. I didn't know her. She wasn't asking for help. But the moment I stood up and walked toward her, the barrier between me and her dissolved. In that small act of connection, I realized there is no other. Her suffering was mine to witness. And in choosing to respond, I wasn't just helping her. I was healing a fracture within myself. This is the truth the Buddha pointed to when he spoke of compassion not as a moral obligation, but as the natural response when the illusion of separateness dissolves. When we believe we are separate, we protect ourselves at all costs. We hoard, we judge, we envy, we fear. But when we awaken to our interconnectedness, those reflexes begin to soften. Generosity becomes natural, kindness flows. Forgiveness arises not from obligation, but from understanding. Imagine a hand with 5 fingers. If one finger is cut, the hand doesn't punish it. It rushes to care for it. Why? Because it recognizes the injury as part of the whole. In the same way, when we see others not as them, but as extensions of the same life we carry, compassion becomes instinctive. This perspective shift doesn't mean we lose our individuality. Rather, we begin to see identity as a temporary costume, useful for functioning, but not the full story. Beneath the surface, we all share the same essence, a longing to be seen, to be safe, to be loved, to belong. One powerful practice to dissolve the illusion of separateness is loving kindness meditation, metta bhavana. It begins with offering well wishes to yourself, then to someone you love, then to a neutral person, then to someone who has caused you pain, and finally to all beings everywhere. At first, it can feel mechanical, even forced. But over time, something shifts. Your heart begins to soften. You start to feel a subtle tenderness arise, even toward those you once resented. That tenderness is not weakness, it is awakening. Another practice is simply to listen deeply. In conversations, instead of planning your next sentence or judging what you hear, just listen. Let yourself enter the other person's experience. Let their words move through you. In that silent attention, you bridge the gap between self and other. Separateness is also reinforced through comparison. We look at others and think, they're ahead, I'm behind. Or they're happier, more successful, more at peace. But comparison is only possible when we believe we are fundamentally disconnected. There is no behind or ahead in awakening. There is only now, this breath, this experience, this beingness. When you begin to see the sacred in everyone, even those who challenge you, you dissolve the illusion that your worth depends on being better, smarter, or more enlightened than someone else. You stop climbing imaginary ladders and start walking together. This also applies to nature. A tree is not separate from the earth that feeds it, or the rain that nourishes it, or the sun that warms it. And neither are we. We breathe in what the trees breathe out. We eat food that was once soil. The very fabric of our body is stitched together from stardust and oxygen and water that has moved through countless other forms. This is not poetic metaphor. It's scientific reality. We are not apart from life. We are life. When this realization settles, something beautiful happens. Gratitude deepens. Fear diminishes. Competition relaxes. We begin to live not from scarcity, but from abundance, not from isolation, but from intimacy. I once met a monk who told me, "We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual presence expressing itself through this moment of being human." That simple sentence changed me. It reminded me that separateness is the dream and unity is the waking up. To dissolve the illusion of separateness doesn't mean we become passive or boundaryless. It means we act from wholeness. We protect not just our community, but the community of life. We care not just for our people, but for all beings who share this earth. And in doing so, we don't lose ourselves. We find our true home. Chapter 7, Embracing Impermanence, Finding Freedom in Change. Nothing stays the same. This may sound like a simple truth, but in Buddhist wisdom, it's one of the deepest insights we can realize. Impermanence, anicca, is the universal law that governs all things. Every experience, every thought, every relationship, every breath is in a state of flux. We intellectually know this. We've watched seasons change, people age, situations evolve. Yet emotionally and psychologically, we often resist it. We crave the familiar, the stable, the predictable. We want good moments to last forever and painful ones to disappear instantly. But clinging to what is meant to pass only deepens our suffering. The Buddha likened life to a river, ever flowing, never the same in any two moments. To try to hold on to a moment is like trying to grasp a current in your hand. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips away. I once worked with a client who was going through the end of a long marriage. She was devastated, not just because of the loss of companionship, but because she had built her entire identity around that relationship. In her words, "I don't know who I am without him." As we gently explored her pain, what emerged was not just grief, but a fear of change, a fear of being nobody. This fear is deeply human. We anchor our sense of self in roles and routines. When they shift, we feel unmoored. But here's the paradox. It is in the falling away of the old that the new self can emerge. Impermanence is not just loss, it's also possibility. It's what allows for growth, creativity, and rebirth. One of the most profound examples of this is the lotus flower, a symbol revered in many Buddhist traditions. The lotus grows in muddy water, its roots are buried in the dark, and yet it rises toward the light, blossoming into exquisite beauty. But the flower doesn't resist the mud, it uses it. That's how transformation happens. In our lives, the mud might be disappointment, heartbreak, failure, or change. But if we accept impermanence, we stop trying to escape the mud and instead allow it to nourish us. There's a practice I often return to when I feel stuck or afraid of change. I go outside and observe nature. A falling leaf, a melting snowflake, a setting sun, all are reminders that beauty does not last forever. And yet it doesn't need to. The fleetingness is the beauty. Think about this. Would a cherry blossom still be as precious if it bloomed all year? Would a rainbow hold the same awe if it lingered forever? It's precisely because things end that we cherish them. When we fully embrace impermanence, our hearts open to the present moment. We stop postponing our joy. We stop waiting for conditions to be perfect. We begin to live now because we know that now is all we have. This also transforms how we deal with pain. When you're in the middle of grief or anxiety, impermanence becomes a quiet comfort. It whispers, "This too will pass." Nothing stays forever, not even suffering. Every emotional storm, no matter how fierce, eventually softens. One teacher once told me, "Don't say, 'I'm sad.' Say, 'Sadness is visiting me right now.'" That simple shift affirms that no emotion is permanent. You are not your sadness. You are the awareness that holds it. The same is true for joy. When you're laughing with a friend, savoring a meal, watching your child sleep, Know that this moment too is impermanent. But instead of grieving that, let it deepen your appreciation. Impermanence turns everyday moments into sacred ones. There's also great freedom in recognizing that we are impermanent too. Our identities, opinions, even our bodies are all changing. What you believe today may shift tomorrow. What you fear now may be your strength later. Nothing is static, not even you. This can be scary, but it's also liberating. It means we are never stuck. We are never finished growing. No past mistake, no fixed trait defines us permanently. With every breath, we are given a new chance. Monastics in the Buddhist tradition often contemplate death, not as a morbid ritual, but as a reminder to live fully. They reflect, death is certain. The time of death is uncertain. This reflection doesn't create fear. It inspires clarity. It invites us to drop what doesn't matter and focus on what does. I've found that when I live with the awareness of impermanence, I forgive more easily. I speak more gently. I let go of grudges because I realize how short and precious this life truly is. I stop wasting energy trying to control the uncontrollable and instead learn to flow with change like water around stones. And perhaps most importantly, I begin to trust that even when things fall apart, something new is waiting to emerge. As Rumi said, try not to resist the changes that come your way. Instead, let life live through you. In a world that's constantly shifting, the most peaceful people are not those who try to hold it still, but those who dance with its rhythms. Chapter 8. The Middle Way. Balance is a spiritual practice. In a world of extremes, where we're told to hustle harder, love unconditionally, detox completely, or detach entirely, the Buddha offers a different path. Not indulgence, not denial, but balance. This is the essence of what he called the middle way. The middle way is not a compromise between two opposites. It is a completely different orientation, a path of wisdom that arises from direct experience. It doesn't reject pleasure, nor does it glorify suffering. It recognizes that both clinging to pleasure and fearing pain create imbalance. Before his enlightenment, the Buddha lived both extremes. First as a prince immersed in luxury and sensual indulgence. Later as a wandering ascetic who nearly died from self-mortification. In the moment of greatest physical weakness, he realized something profound. Neither path led to liberation. And so, beneath the Bodhi tree, he chose another way. One rooted in awareness, compassion, and balance. This is not just an ancient teaching. It's incredibly relevant in today's world. Many of us swing between excess and deprivation, driven by the belief that happiness lies at the edge of intensity. We overwork, then crash. We indulge, then feel guilt. We go through cycles of burnout, followed by numbing escapism. Our minds whisper, more is better, or nothing at all. But the middle way reminds us, peace is not found at the extremes. It lives in the pause between them. I once mentored a student who struggled with meditation. She was either trying so hard to empty her mind that she became frustrated, or she gave up entirely, believing she wasn't spiritual enough. I shared this teaching with her. Don't try to force stillness. Don't abandon the practice either. Just sit. Notice. Breathe. Let it be enough. That's the middle way, not forcing, not fleeing, but meeting each moment with gentleness and curiosity. In practical terms, balance looks different for each of us. For some, it means learning to say no. For others, it means learning to say yes. For some, it's taking rest without guilt. For others, it's showing up even when it's uncomfortable. The middle way invites us to listen, not to external ideals, but to the inner intelligence of our own being. It's not a rigid formula. It's a relationship, a dance between effort and surrender, activity and rest, structure and flow. In Buddhist psychology, This is closely tied to the idea of the Eightfold Path, a framework of wise living that avoids excesses. Whether it's right effort, right action, or right concentration, each element invites mindfulness, not extremism. For example, right effort is not about working harder or pushing through. It's about applying just enough energy to maintain awareness without strain. Like tuning an instrument, if the string is too tight, it breaks. Too loose, it makes no sound. This teaching has reshaped how I approach my daily life. I used to treat spirituality like a performance. I pushed myself to meditate longer, fast more strictly, study more intensely, believing it would accelerate my growth. But in that striving, I missed the essence of the practice. Now I ask myself, am I acting from wholeness or from lack? Am I pushing too hard or pulling away? Can I meet this moment with balance? Sometimes balance looks like setting boundaries, saying I need rest or I need space without guilt. Sometimes it looks like stepping up and leaning into discomfort because avoidance has become its own form of indulgence. And sometimes balance is letting go of the idea that there's a perfect balance. Even the middle way is not a fixed point, it shifts. What feels balanced today may feel excessive tomorrow. What once felt challenging may now feel nourishing. Wisdom lies in returning to awareness again and again and adjusting with kindness. One beautiful analogy I heard from a monk is this. Imagine walking on a narrow bridge with your arms outstretched. If you lean too far left, you tilt. Too far right, you fall. But if you walk slowly, adjusting each step as you go, you stay upright. That is the middle way. This path also teaches us to befriend duality. We learn to hold both joy and sorrow without being consumed by either. We stop chasing highs or avoiding lows. Instead, we develop emotional flexibility, the ability to be present with what is, without needing it to be different. In relationships, the middle way invites us to love deeply without attachment, to speak honestly without cruelty, to offer support without self-abandonment. It helps us navigate complexity with grace. In practice, cultivating balance means checking in with yourself often. Is this nourishing or depleting me? Is this action aligned with my values or driven by fear? Am I clinging to intensity or avoiding discomfort? With time, you begin to trust the wisdom of moderation, not as a lack of passion, but as a sign of depth. True presence doesn't scream, it listens. True strength doesn't force, it flows. The middle way is not the easy path. It requires constant awareness, honest reflection, and gentle recalibration. But it is the most sustainable path. It keeps us rooted and fluid, grounded yet open. And perhaps most beautifully, it reminds us that peace is not something we reach by striving or renouncing. It's something we return to when we walk the path of enough. Chapter 9, Understanding Suffering. Walking through pain with clarity and compassion. Suffering is not a flaw in the system. It is part of being human. This is the first noble truth of Buddhism. Dukkha, often translated as suffering, but also meaning dissatisfaction, unease, or stress. The Buddha did not deny the beauty of life. He simply pointed out that even the most beautiful moments are touched by impermanence, and therefore vulnerability. To understand suffering is not to drown in it, but to walk through it with clarity and compassion. Most of us, whether consciously or not, spend our lives trying to avoid suffering. We chase comfort, numb our pain, distract ourselves with pleasure or productivity. But what we resist tends to persist. Pain that is unexamined becomes chronic. Wounds that are unacknowledged deepen. Buddhist wisdom invites us to stop running and to turn toward our suffering, not with judgment, but with gentle curiosity. I remember a time in my life when grief cracked me open. I had lost someone I loved deeply and no words could cushion the ache. For weeks I tried to stay busy, tried to keep moving, but late at night, the sorrow returned like a tide, flooding everything I had tried to suppress. Eventually, I sat down one evening, lit a candle, and simply let myself feel it. No stories, no distractions, just breath, body, and grief. I didn't try to fix it. I didn't try to make sense of it. I just stayed. And in that staying, something softened. That was the beginning of transformative suffering. Not the kind that breaks you, but the kind that awakens you. The second noble truth reveals the cause of suffering. Tanha, or craving. We suffer because we cling to pleasure, to identity, to certainty, to outcomes. When things don't go the way we imagined, we resist. And in that resistance, suffering arises, but the Buddha didn't leave us there. The third noble truth offers hope. Cessation is possible. Suffering can end, not by escaping life, but by transforming our relationship with it. This doesn't mean that pain disappears. It means we no longer make it worse by layering it with aversion, blame, or self-pity. We stop asking, "Why me?" and begin asking, "What is this moment asking of me?" In practice, this means meeting suffering with mindful presence. Try this. The next time you feel overwhelmed, whether by anxiety, sadness, or physical pain, pause. Place your hand on your heart. Breathe deeply and silently say, "This is suffering. Others feel this too. May I meet it with compassion." This simple act connects your pain to the shared human experience. You are not broken. You are not alone. You are feeling what countless others have felt and are feeling right now. This is compassionate awareness, and it transforms isolation into connection. One of the most beautiful teachings I've encountered is this: pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. This isn't about suppressing pain. It's about recognizing that much of our suffering comes not from the pain itself, but from our reaction to it. The mental narrative, the resistance, the identification. Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron describes this through the metaphor of being shot with two arrows. The first arrow is the unavoidable pain of life, loss, illness, disappointment. The second arrow is the one we shoot ourselves, anger, blame, rumination. Through mindfulness, we can learn to stop at the first arrow. This understanding also teaches us to be more compassionate with others. When we realize that everyone suffers, no matter how polished their exterior, we begin to relate with greater gentleness. Instead of judgment, we offer presence. Instead of advice, we offer listening. Suffering, when met with mindfulness, becomes a doorway to depth. It humbles us. It deepens our empathy. It teaches us what really matters. And it opens the heart in ways that comfort never could. There's a quiet strength that arises in those who walk through fire without trying to escape it. A softness that isn't weak, but wide. A wisdom that doesn't come from books, but from having stood in the storm and stayed. In Buddhist practice, this is the beginning of liberation. Not freedom from pain, but freedom within it. The ability to hold joy and sorrow in the same breath. To smile with tears in your eyes. To trust that no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes. And when it does, you find yourself changed. Not because the world became perfect, but because you no longer needed it to be. Chapter 10. Loving kindness and the heart of Interbeing. If mindfulness is the ground of Buddhist practice, then loving kindness, metta, is the flowering of the heart. It is not mere sentiment or surface-level positivity. It is a conscious cultivation of a heart that wishes well to all beings, without exception, without condition. Loving kindness begins as a personal practice, but it naturally ripples outward. It transforms how we see ourselves, how we relate to others, and how we move through the world. It softens the sharp edges of reactivity, bridges the gaps created by fear, and reconnects us with what Buddhism calls interbeing, the deep truth that we are not separate. When we cultivate metta, we begin with ourselves, not out of selfishness, but because we cannot pour from an empty cup. Offering love inward is not indulgence, it's preparation. It is the soil from which compassion for others can truly grow. This can feel difficult at first. For many of us, the harshest voice in our lives is the one in our own heads. We are taught to strive, to improve, to compete, but rarely to embrace ourselves as we are. And yet, this is where the healing begins. The classic metta meditation starts with this simple phrase, "May I be happy, may I be healthy, may I be safe, may I live with ease." At first, these words may feel mechanical or even uncomfortable, but with repetition and sincerity, they begin to penetrate the armor we built around our own hearts. We start to see ourselves not as a project to be fixed, but as a being worthy of love simply for existing. From there, we extend these wishes outward, to someone we love, to someone neutral, to someone we find difficult, to all beings everywhere. Each stage challenges the ego's boundaries. It stretches the heart beyond preference. It invites us to love not because others are lovable, but because we are loving. This practice becomes even more powerful when combined with the understanding of interbeing. Thich Nhat Hanh often reminded his students that a cloud can become tea, that in your morning cup of tea is the cloud that once rained upon a mountain, the sun that warmed the leaves, the farmer who harvested them. Nothing exists alone. In the same way, we are not isolated individuals. We are threads in the same vast tapestry. When one thread is pulled, the whole fabric shifts. Loving kindness practice helps us remember this truth, not just intellectually, but somatically. As we sit and send goodwill to others, we begin to feel the connection that was always there. We soften our grip on judgment. We hold people's suffering with a gentler gaze. We realize that the line between self and other was never as solid as it seemed. I once led a retreat where a woman shared that she had been estranged from her sister for over 10 years. Through the retreat's loving kindness sessions, she began to include her sister in her meditation. At first, she could only say the words mechanically, but over time something shifted. The sharp edges of resentment dulled. She didn't call her sister right away, but she no longer carried the bitterness in her body. That was the beginning of reconciliation, not just with her sister, but with herself. Loving kindness does not require us to forget harm or deny pain. It asks only that we open to the possibility of healing. It plants seeds of understanding in places where division once grew. And this, too, is where the heart of Buddhist wisdom and modern humanity meet. We live in a world that often glorifies separation, my truth, my path, my success, my trauma. But in the deepest sense, there is no my without we. Your joy affects the world. Your suffering echoes in the collective field. Your healing contributes to the healing of others. When we practice loving kindness, we become part of something greater, a quiet revolution of care. We stop asking, what can I get from the world, and begin asking, how can I bring more love into it? This shift doesn't require grand gestures. It begins in the simplest of ways, smiling at a stranger without expectation, sending a silent blessing to someone in traffic, listening fully without planning your reply, saying, I see you, I'm here. Loving kindness is not always soft. Sometimes it shows up as fierce compassion, the courage to speak up, to protect the vulnerable, to forgive with boundaries. But it always arises from the same source, the understanding that we are all in this together. One of the most moving teachings from the Buddha comes from the Metta Sutta, where he says, just as a mother would protect her only child with her life, even so, let one cultivate a boundless love toward all beings. This is not metaphor. This is practice. And like all practice, it begins now, with one breath, one thought, one intention. As we cultivate loving kindness and embrace interbeing, we are no longer strangers in a hostile world. We are kin in a shared home. Every act of kindness becomes a prayer. Every moment of awareness becomes a blessing. And every heart that chooses love, no matter how quietly, becomes a light for others. And so we arrive at the quiet truth. Control was never the key to peace. The more we clung to certainty, the more anxious we became. But the moment we began to loosen our grip, even just a little, a new kind of freedom appeared. This is the gift of Buddhist wisdom. It doesn't promise a life free of chaos. It offers us tools to meet chaos with grace. Today, we explored what it means to let go, not as a form of surrendering to failure, but as a form of surrendering to flow. Because when we stop fighting against the tide, we begin to feel the current that's always been there. Quiet, steady, wise. Maybe your plans didn't unfold the way you envisioned. Maybe life handed you something unexpected. And maybe that's not a mistake. Maybe that's life's way of redirecting you, of giving you a deeper chance to meet yourself. Because the truth is, our deepest growth rarely happens when we're in control. It happens in the in-between, in the pauses, in the unraveling. So here's the invitation. The next time something doesn't go your way, pause. Notice your urge to fix, to push, to plan. And instead, just for a moment, try softening. Try listening. Ask yourself, what is life asking me to see right now? What if this isn't a problem to solve, but a doorway to presence? As you go about your day, let this reminder echo in the background. You don't need to control everything to be at peace. You don't need to predict every outcome to feel safe. All you need is to return to your breath, to the moment, to yourself. Because when you do, something magical happens. Clarity replaces confusion. Stillness replaces chaos. Trust replaces fear. So take a deep breath. Gently unclench. Let go. And remember, dear one, what's meant for you will not miss you. It will find you, not because you chased it, but because you were finally still enough to receive it. This is the heart of mindful healing. Thank you for being here. If this message touched something within you, I invite you to share it with someone else who might need it today. Leave a comment. Tell me what part of today's video spoke most to your journey. I read every word. And if you haven't already, subscribe to join us on this path of peace, presence, and healing. Until next time, may you be well, may you be safe, and may you walk gently in the world. Namaste.